So Ananda, or bliss in general, versus the Anandamaya Kosha. So, we use this model, the 5 Kosha model, and we have Ananda in the middle, and the translation of Ananda is bliss. And so it's good to have an understanding of what that actually means. So not in yoga therapy, but in regular yoga, the search for enlightenment, there's this idea that, there's this part of ourselves that's part of everything else. And that part is inherently or innately blissful. But that does not mean that when we contact it, or I should say, that does not necessarily mean that our experience of that is static. So there are higher levels of samadhi, of like experiential awakening, where you can come into contact with this bliss and sort of be living in it. But mostly people experience it in big ways through like big experiences. So you'll hear people talk about moments in their life where they've experienced large experiences that make them realize they're connected to something bigger. It's innately pleasant and blissful. Sometimes it's ecstatic, right? But that's not, and this is what I wanted to talk about, that's not what we're going for when we are trying to balance Anandamaya Kosha or be in contact with Anandamaya Kosha. Those experiences are in between our sort of what you could think of as your normal experience, and they are an outcropping, right, of the sort of natural awakening, right, that occurs with people. And they can be sort of brought on a little bit by certain types of practices, but that's not the goal. And so you probably heard that a lot, like that's not, the goal. But then the question is like, well, what is the goal? And so the goal would be to have that bliss or Ananda be, you're in contact with it and aware of it. And because you're aware of it, it influences your experience on a regular basis. But that influence doesn't mean that you don't experience pleasure and pain. It more means that there's maybe I'll use the word santosha. It's almost like the experience of santosha, of contentment, is underneath those experiences, and you're aware of that. So an example of that would be being very upset about something that's happening, but also at the same time being aware that that's not the only reality, right? Like your perception at the moment is not the only reality. So in a therapeutic context, the reason this is maybe useful to know is that we're trying to get people to connect to that as a therapeutic tool, right? Let's say to treat issues, and let's use depression because that's the way we might be thinking about Anandamaya Kosha. So someone's depressed, and if they had that sort of base level of contentment, the depression would be alleviated. So not all sadness and not all pain, but the sort of chronic state of depression could be alleviated, because that contentment would sort of waft through everything else, including our emotional states. And so we have techniques given to us by the yoga tradition to help with that, which include connection to other people. And the reason that's important is because other people remind us of this. It's like when we can't see our own connection or contentment, being around other people will often help us see that. And then there are practices to help us see it too that we would do alone. And those are in the course, but that connection is important. In other words, that the understanding of Ananda is important because you can't help somebody find it if you don't really understand what it is yourself. And what it is that thing that gets you up in the morning, that makes you happy is a very loaded word, but more pleased than not to be alive. So it's the thing that brings us the sort of joy of living that's not the same as the survival instinct, is one way to look at it. So clinically or therapeutically, you would never really, your goal is not to have somebody really experience joy. That's not your goal with somebody when you're trying to get them to find Ananda. It's to experience that thing underneath the emotional states, right? That feels more like the contentment that then breeds joy and happiness. So even if you're not experiencing it at this moment, we've all experienced that. And for a healthy individual, I'm not talking like spiritual healthy necessarily, but just sort of, let's just say a mentally healthy individual, is kind of going in and out of this all the time. And so when you get more out than in, and that continues, more out, more out, more out, more out than in, that's when you start having what you would call disease states based on this. So it's not so much a matter of, and I will say that one of the things you see often is huge amounts of avoidance when this happens, because when you're more out than in, you're experiencing more pain than contentment, a lot more pain than contentment all the time. And you could look at it as similar to like nervous system states where you're not supposed to be in a sympathetic, a fight or flight kind of state all the time. So, if you're around, like, it's a form of torture to, like, basically beep a horn 24/7, or I think the military uses, like, they beam in certain frequencies into houses when they want people to come out, right? Because, like, eventually it'll give you headaches and drive you mad, and you'll do anything to get away from it. And it's sort of similar when you don't have any connection to Ananda. You're out, you can't stand it, and then you have sort of what you would consider painful or unpleasant states, and then you try to avoid those. So you go from Ananda, less Ananda, to like suffering and pain, and then you have suffering and pain, which leads to avoidance, and avoidance leads to seeking of false pleasure, which leads to addiction, whether it's drugs and alcohol and things, or addiction to anything really, even staring at Facebook, addictive tendencies that try to get you out of your experience to give you a false sense of pleasure, but it's not Ananda, right? It's fleeting. It's a little chemical squirt in your brain that works for like 8 seconds and then shuts off, right? Like sugar or flipping through social media. So that's how it becomes relevant to us, right? Because we begin to see sometimes with clients that giving practices to connect to that's important, but that is not the same, and this was sort of the question, as blissing out. So large bliss states, there's a lot to be said for them. They're useful in that they show you what's possible. They're useful that they show you the alternative to our current reality or perception, right? So they often show us that the way we perceive things is not correct or completely correct. So that's helpful to know that you're wrong when you're wrong. So they're very useful in that way, but they're not useful as like a tool. Like they don't solve anything. It's more this regular connection to Ananda that's important.